Hi traders, welcome to the very first lesson in the PineScript Mastery course, or Basics course if you're watching the Basics version. This lesson is going to introduce you to the complete fundamental basics of programming. So if you're already an experienced programmer, you might want to skip this lesson, but if you're new to programming, if you've never written code before, this is going to be an important lesson for you. So let's get into it. What the is a programming language? A programming language is a means of telling a computer what you want it to do in English or whatever language you write your code in, and then that information is converted into data that the computer understands. So code is basically a set of instructions for performing repetitive tasks on your computer. Code can be thought of as a formula, like a mathematical formula, or an algorithm, or a recipe, like a cooking recipe, or perhaps even instructions on how to put furniture together, something like that. Something that if you were to follow it note for note every time, then it will produce the same result every time. Unless you're working with IKEA furniture, but that's not relevant for today's lesson. Now, it's important to draw attention to the fact that computers are dumb. They're not very creative, at least for now. I'm sure someone out there is working on a real-life Terminator. But until machine learning and artificial intelligence gets to a point where computers can actually think for themselves and solve problems without human input, then we have to be aware of the fact that computers can only be as good as we are as coders. There's a term in programming culture called garbage in, garbage out. Basically, it means if you put in garbage code, you are going to get a garbage result. Especially in the beginning of your programming journey, you should expect to run into frequent challenges and mistakes that you've made. But hopefully with the help of this course, that won't happen nearly as frequently as it would if you were to try and venture into this world without guidance. I've been programming for over 16 years now as of recording this, and I've been coding in Pine for the past 4 years or so. And so my hope is that I can teach you how to write good, clean code that works every time in PineScript, so that you don't need to go through the frustration that I went through in trying to learn all of this stuff through trial and error and through reading hundreds of pages of documentation. So basically, if you give a computer bad instructions, you are going to get bad results. And so in this course, I'm going to teach you how to give PineScript good instructions so that you get good results. Anyway, let's move on. Before we continue, I thought it might be interesting to go over a brief history of programming, just to give you an idea of how awesome the tools at our disposal are today. Coding was created because in the beginning, we had to work with on-off switches, and that sucked. What I mean by that is all of your code was basically ones and zeros. Now, this hasn't changed. What you see on your screen right now in this presentation is still ones and zeros, on and off, yes and no. But what you see is millions of combinations of those ones and zeros working together to build an image on your screen. But back in the beginning of computers and this technology, programming was very arduous and time-consuming and difficult. In fact, in the beginning, it actually required physical objects to code with, such as punched cards, which you can see an example of in this video in the bottom right. Then from punched cards, we moved to the world of machine coding, like assembly. There were languages out there that were pretty much just one step above ones and zeros, or binary code. It was still really hard to code in, even though it no longer required physical objects. It really was not an intuitive experience to code back in the early days. It certainly wasn't as easy as it is now to just open up your web browser and start writing code. But back in the early days, the pioneers of programming, the people who mastered machine code, eventually built tools and layers and other languages to improve upon machine code and make programming more intuitive. And now, in the modern day, we have thousands of different modern coding languages at our disposal. Now, the reason why we have so many languages is because each language has its own unique purpose, or it improves upon a previous one. The reason for that is there is no one-size-fits-all for programming, hence the variety of languages. For example, PineScript is built for analyzing price data on your charts. You're not going to build the next billion-dollar app or the next Facebook using PineScript. It just cannot be done, and you wouldn't want to do it because the power of PineScript is its simplicity, the fact that it is a domain-specific language, it is specific to TradingView. That gives it a lot of power in that domain, but it also significantly limits its capabilities outside of that domain. But anyway, the point of this is to say that you can learn any programming language you want, but you need to pick one that suits the goal you have in mind, the right tool for the right job, as it were. Moving on, what are the elements of programming? Well, all programming languages have a similar framework, meaning that if you learn and master one language, even PineScript, it will make it a lot easier for you to go on and learn another programming language. That's because there are a lot of similarities, a lot of similar patterns and rules that govern coding languages. So all programming languages work with expressions, which can be thought of as sentences or commands that either tell the computer to do something or request something from the computer. So maybe you request a calculation from the computer and then you tell it to draw the result onto the screen or onto your chart. That would be done using a code expression. Now, all of these words are unnecessarily convoluted and you don't really need to know this stuff in order to work with coding. I just thought it would be best to give you the fundamental jargon and official language around these concepts. But you don't need to know what an expression is to use one, just like you don't need to know how a sentence works in order to express yourself. A lot of this stuff will just be intuitive once you get into coding. But anyway, an expression can be thought of as a sentence in English or language. And just like with language, there are rules that govern the syntax of how you express yourself. So syntax can be thought of as punctuation, so commas, exclamation marks, question marks, and so on. It's basically the grammar of your code. So when you are expressing yourself in code, you need to abide by the rules of the programming language so that the programming language, when it gets executed by the engine that runs that code, it knows how to read your code. That information is governed by the syntax rules of the language, which I'll teach you in this introduction section to PineScript. The next thing we have to work with in all programming languages is data types. So data types are just things like numbers, words, letters, text. In the case of PineScript, it might be drawing tools like lines, tables. They all count as data types or types of data. And then we have collections of data. So you could have a collection of a certain data type. This is usually represented as an array, and we have arrays in PineScript that we can work with. And an array is like a list or a collection of data. So you could have an array or a collection that is full of tables, and each table has a different purpose on your chart, and you can keep them all organized in one collection of data called an array. We won't be working with that too often in PineScript, but the option is there when we need it. And then finally, we have outputs of some kind, because what use is calculating things using code if we don't output it and see the result? So all languages have outputs of some kind. In PineScript, the most common output you'll be using is the plot function to plot numbers and lines onto your chart, and maybe some of the other drawing tools like shapes, drawing shapes onto the chart, and of course alerts as well. Triggering alerts in your code counts as an output. Now, all of these elements are governed by rules, and these rules are the syntax of the language, like I mentioned earlier. We have the syntax of the language, which is basically the grammar of our code, and then we also have the semantics of our code, which is the meaning of the code we write. So this can be a little bit confusing, but I'll break it down as best I can. And again, you don't need to know this information because it will become intuitive to you when you start working with the code. This is just the theory behind programming languages. So if this is going over your head, don't freak out. You don't need to know all this information. I'm just teaching this to you because I think it will help you when we get into the actual code to better understand what's going on. So first of all, what is syntax? I've already explained this briefly, but let's go into more information about it. Syntax is like grammatical rules in human language. For example, punctuation, commas, brackets, semicolons. We use them in our writing, in our text, to punctuate and apply grammar to our sentences so that they make sense to read. For example, here's a sentence. The dog was happy, so it wagged its tail. This is a grammatically correct sentence. But this, on the other hand, is not a grammatically correct sentence. If you were to write this, people would think you were crazy. And if you were to write your code in a similar way to this, where you mess up all of your syntax, your script won't run, it won't compile. The computer won't know what to do with it. So syntax is important. And all programming languages have different syntax rules. So PineScript has its own unique syntax, which will be similar to other languages, but still unique to PineScript. For example, for some programming languages, you might use a curly bracket where PineScript uses a regular bracket. Little details like that. And this syntax informs the computer how to interpret the instructions that you give it in your code. So it's extremely important to know the correct syntax rules to use in your scripts in order to avoid errors, which is why you're here and what I will teach you throughout this course. So that is the core description of syntax. What is semantics? Well, semantics give our code expressions meaning, and semantics isn't just relevant to code, it's also relevant to language. For example, here is a quote by the great Noam Chomsky. This is an example of a syntactically correct sentence, or a sentence that has correct grammar and technically is a valid sentence in English, but it's nonsense. It doesn't make any sense because if you apply the meaning to the sentence, it becomes gibberish. So even though it's a correctly formatted sentence, and we have nouns where there should be adjectives, where there should be punctuation where it should be, and so on, the semantics of this sentence renders this sentence as gibberish. It's the same in code. You could write code that is technically correct in its syntax, but maybe you use the wrong data type. You try to combine two data types that are not compatible with each other because it doesn't make sense to combine them. So this sentence makes sense in terms of valid English syntax, but what does it mean for an idea to sleep furiously? It's nonsense. Programming is the same. So for example, in PineScript, we can say x equals 1 plus 3, and then the value of 4 will be applied to the variable x. And if we were to reference x later on in our script, that would be the same as referencing the number 4. We can also say in PineScript, the variable text is set to the text hello plus the text world. If we were to execute this code in PineScript, after this code was executed, if we were to reference the variable named text, that variable would look like this. However, if we were to try to do this in PineScript, so here we are saying assign the variable text the value of 1, the number 1, plus the word hello. Now you might think that this would just simply return the text 1 hello with the number 1 at the beginning of this text. But actually in programming, this would break your script. Because as I said earlier, computers are dumb. The computer doesn't know that the number 1 can also be represented as the text 1 or the digit 1 in text form. So if you wanted to combine the number 1 or any other number with text, you need to explicitly tell PineScript that you want to convert that number into text before you add the two text variables together, or the two text values together. So now I've probably lost a few of you, especially those of you who are totally new to programming. I apologize for that. This stuff is confusing in the beginning. It is hard to wrap your head around in the beginning. But once we get into actual code and I start showing you practical examples and demonstrations of this information in practice, in live code, I promise this will begin to make more sense. So in conclusion, in summary, programming languages simply make talking to computers easier. We can tell a computer in plain English, or almost plain English. It won't look like plain English to you at the start of your coding journey, but as you get more experienced, it's basically the same as plain English, or at least algebra. We're basically doing math with words. But don't worry, it's very simple math. For those of you who are like me and basically mathematically dyslexic, you don't need to be good at math in order to be good at coding. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here. So PineScript is extremely easy to use, and it will make chart analysis in code very, very easy for us. The next thing to summarize or mention is that each language has its own unique purpose and its own rules. So if you were to go off and try to write Python code, for example, and you use the rules that we use with PineScript, your script will not compile. You need to use the unique rules of the language you're coding in. In this course, I'm going to teach you PineScript's rules and syntax and how to express yourself in PineScript code. But as I said earlier in this presentation, once you learn a language, learning your second language becomes a lot easier. So even if you learn Pine and decide later on you want to move to a more powerful programming language, or one that's not confined just to the TradingView platform, this course and this material that you learn here will still help you with that. And so, as I said, each language has its own purpose. HTML, I'm sure you're all familiar with that language by now. Every website on earth basically uses some form of HTML somewhere in its code. It's used for web design. We don't use HTML to create Excel formulas or analyze price charts. I mean, I don't even think it's possible. Maybe in the latest versions of HTML, HTML5 or whatever, you could probably do some more advanced things, but it would be a massive headache compared to using PineScript, which was built from the ground up with the sole purpose and goal of making it really, really easy and simple for us to analyze charts. And then finally, computers, what? Oh, that's supposed to say computers are stupid, but I guess I'm stupid. It says computers are stupid, so you must be very clear in your instructions. This is a great example of a typo, which, just like in English, can turn a sentence into a stupid sentence that doesn't make sense. This can happen in your code as well. A single typo can break your script. So that's kind of a poetic way to end this presentation. So I'll leave it there, and I'll see you in the next lesson. I hope you're excited to dive in, because things are about to get a lot more interesting as we move forward.